Hello, today we begin our study of the theory of evolution. We will examine the scientific evidence that is used to support the theory, as well as looking at the scientific evidence that doesn't necessarily match up with the theory, and also explore the ramifications for the theory in terms of our faith as Christians. The book begins by taking a look at three separate meanings of the word evolution. The first definition simply is change over time. So this is the simplest meaning of the word evolution. This is in reference not in respect to the change in one individual over the course of its lifetime, but we're looking at groups of organisms, populations of organisms, and how do they change as a group over many generations. And so this is the idea that you can look back in history at fossilized life forms and you can document change over many years. This definition is one that we refer to as microevolution. Micro meaning small changes, small incremental changes over time. This is essentially the process of adaptation. We see many evidences of this in nature, especially experiments with bacteria that reproduce quickly. We can observe many generations in a relatively short amount of time. We've seen small changes in populations of other animals. So this definition is not one that causes much controversy. However, the second definition, the idea of universal common descent, is a source of debate. Universal common descent is the idea that all organisms come from a single common ancestor. So essentially what that means is if you look at the diversity of organisms that exist on the planet today, the millions of species that surround us, that you could trace them back on one family tree to one original life form. That original life form is supposedly something that would be simple, kind of like a bacteria cell. The idea is from that bacteria cell, through small incremental changes over millions and even billions of years, that's how we have produced the diversity of life today. So this is one of the main topics that the book addresses. The first half of the book essentially explores the difference between monophyletic, mono meaning one, versus polyphyletic, poly meaning two or many. So what that's saying is there one family tree for all organisms? Is it a tree with just one trunk or root? Or poly, are there many family trees in essence? The third definition of evolution is simply exploring why do things change over time and looking at the mechanism that could potentially produce the large-scale changes, the macro changes that a tree of life would propose. The mechanism in Darwin's theory is natural selection. And so this third definition essentially says that through the process of natural selection, if you give it enough time, small incremental changes can produce the variety of life that we see today and can produce fundamentally new life forms. The book uses the term neo-Darwinism, and essentially what that means is that if you looked at Darwin's original theory, this is a theory that was far before any kind of molecular knowledge that we have today of DNA. So if you took Darwin's original theory, but then added the new information that we now know about DNA and mutations, that would now be known as neo-Darwinism. So it's essentially Darwin's original ideas, but added to that the new molecular evidence that we have about DNA. So again, definitions of evolution in the simplest terms, it just simply means change over time The idea is change in populations, not an individual. This is not debated. We can witness this. However, definitions 2 and 3 are a source of controversy and a source of debate, and that's where our focus will be, looking at this idea of the diversity of life and can that all be attributed to one family tree? And does natural selection have the potential, or does it have the power to create these fundamentally new life forms? The study of evolution is, by definition, a historical science where we are looking at the past and simply by looking at what we can observe in the present. So essentially looking at history from its results of what we see today. This is a quote from Sherlock Holmes. "Circumstantial evidence is a very tricky thing," answered Holmes. "It may seem to point to one thing, but if you shift your point of view, you may find it pointing to something different." So this is kind of the fundamental point in the textbook, without directly saying it, that most biology textbooks approach this topic from a naturalistic worldview, meaning that everything around us can be explained through simple natural processes. However, as Christians, we approach things from a Christian worldview, and that fundamentally changes how we approach information and how we view it and the conclusions that we come up with. And so Darwin essentially was doing the same thing. He was making observations of what he saw around him and trying to deduce what could have happened historically. So again, the two main topics that we're going to look at, this idea of universal common descent. Does the evidence that we have match that idea of one family tree? And secondly, what is the creative power of natural selection? In other words, this mechanism, this process of natural selection, does it have the power to produce the kinds of changes that would need to take place to have one family tree? In other words, to go from a single-celled organism like a bacteria to the complex multicellular life forms that we see today. So one of our first main goals in this study is to be able to articulate what Darwin's theory says. And one of the fundamental key pieces of that is this process of natural selection. You've probably heard natural selection referred to as survival of the fittest. And that's essentially what we're talking about. The first component, though, is that in a population, and a population is just a group of the same type of organism, in other words, the same species living together, there have to be some differences. We have just finished our study of human genetics, so it's obvious that there are differences within humans. And that same thing is true of all living things. There are differences. We call those differences variations. The next main component of natural selection is that those differences, as we have learned, have to be something that can be passed down from a parent to their offsprings. We say that those traits have to be heritable, and that's the idea of heritability. Finally, in order for natural selection to occur, there has to be something that is reducing the survival or the reproduction of individuals. In other words, there has to be some sort of competition. There has to be some sort of struggle to survive. So this could be a predator that is killing prey. It could be competition for limited food resources. It could be competition for limited water or shelter. It could even be disease. So there has to be something that is decreasing survival so that not all individuals survive. And so the idea then is that whatever characteristic or variation an individual possesses that allows it to better survive and to reproduce more offspring, that is the variation or the trait that you'll tend to see in the future. So one common example is this idea of coloring or camouflage. So if there's a variation that allows individuals to be a different color that blends in better, that's better camouflaged, those individuals with that coloring will be more predominant in future generations because they have been able to survive better, and because they've survived, they've reproduced more offspring. Because they've reproduced offspring, they have passed those genes on. Therefore, those genes are more predominant in the population as a whole. So again, what we're seeing is a change in the group as a whole, the average. So you can think about it as the average number of individuals that are one color or another. It could be differences in size. It could be differences in any kind of feature or trait that is genetically determined. So again, natural selection, survival of the fittest, simply there are differences. Those differences need to be based on genetics, things that parents can pass to their offspring, and there has to be some sort of struggle for existence so that not all individuals survive. The idea is those individuals that are better able to survive because of certain traits, it's those traits that we're going to see in future generations. This idea of these small changes happening from one generation to another, shifts in population, are referred to as microevolution. Again, micro means small, so these are small shifts. We see several examples of those types of changes around us. The examples that your book uses are artificial selection in dogs, Galapagos finches, and peppered moths. So this first one, the idea of artificial selection. So artificial selection essentially means we as humans select which individuals to breed as dogs, and then trying to select for certain distinct features. So if you go back in history and you look at the first dogs, really they were just these sort of blended mutts. But over 100 years' time, we very purposely selected individuals for certain characteristics, such as larger heads in the case of a bulldog, and that in just 100 years, we have created these new breeds. Now again, they're still the same species, they're still dogs, but we've produced new breeds by purposely selecting who reproduces and whose genes get passed on. So the idea is that if this were to happen in nature, that instead of us selecting the traits, it's survival selects the traits. Another example that is commonly referenced are the Galapagos finches. These finches were observed by Darwin in his his trip around the world, where he observed many different animal species. And so back in the 1970s, researchers noticed that after a drought, many of the finches died because of a lack of food, and that in that time period, if you measured the average size of the beak before the drought versus the average size of the beak after the drought, that there was this small shift. So the average size of beak got larger simply because if there is a lack of water, the seeds that will be left are going to be harder, and you would need a larger beak to crack those open. So those birds that had those larger beaks would be better able to survive because they're the ones that survive, they reproduce. Those are the genes that get passed on. Another example that's commonly referenced are the peppered moths. So back in England, around the time of the Industrial Revolution, in the forest, we would find moths that were either white with black speckling. So if you look in this circle here, you see one very well camouflaged. There's also a genetic trait that is recessive So homozygous recessive moths come out dark colored. Well, these trees are covered with this scaly, light-colored lichen that covers the tree bark. And so when that lichen is there, these lighter colored moths, called peppered moths, camouflage a whole lot better than the dark moths. So you can imagine that if there were birds trying to find moths to eat, the black ones would be picked off a whole lot faster than the white ones, just simply because they stand out more. Well, lichen are very sensitive to pollution, and the Industrial Revolution generated a lot of air pollution, and so the soot in the air killed the lichen, and so then we saw there was a shift in the environment that these moths were living in. The trees, instead of being light colored, were now dark colored. Because of that shift in the environment, there was a shift in which gene was better suited for camouflage. So now we find that these recessive moths, the dark colored ones, were actually blending in better than the light colored ones. And so after that happened in the environment, the light colored moths became less numerous than the dark colored. So again, we see this shift in population. So again, these are examples of microevolution. Again, micro, small shifts in a population. Not looking at any one particular moth or individual changing color. No, we're looking at, as a group, the average changing before and after this change in environment. So the idea, again, that the dark moths were better camouflaged, and so they survive better. So this is used as an example of natural selection ability to produce changes over time. So again, in a relatively short amount of time, we see a change in population. So that part's not really debated. Here's the debate: is yes, natural selection can produce small changes, but can natural selection produce large changes? So remember, this tree of life, at the base of that tree are very simple unicellular life forms. At the top of that tree are the complex multicellular life forms that we're familiar with today. So if you give it enough time, like 3.5 billion years, could all of those small changes add up to some really big changes, going from unicellular to complex multicellular? That's where the controversy is. Can natural selection be the source of those kinds of really large changes? So the book makes an argument that when you take microevolution, again, these small changes, and you extrapolate, that would be kind of like looking at a tree after a first year, this sapling, and measuring the height, doing that again after 3 years, and then based on that, you could kind of make a guess about how big that tree would be in 5 years. Again, with the finches, well, if we observed a certain amount of change after one drought, what would happen if there were 20 consecutive droughts? Could you extrapolate out? In other words, could you project into the future the extent of the changes that you would see? So instead of beaks just becoming a little bit larger over enough time, could you end up developing a completely new species of finch? So the argument in the book is that when we see changes around us in organisms, there tend to be some limits. And so as through artificial selection, we sort of push the boundaries with dog breeding, we notice that we're starting to see health consequences when nature is sort of pushed to the limits, whether that's hip dysplasia in German Shepherds, heart problems in Great Danes, or just simply the head size of the bulldog becoming an issue for the birth of new puppies. And so again, if we go back to our tree, you can project out to year 5, but it seems a little bit illogical and illegitimate to continue that projection out for 1,000 years. That would be unreasonable to think that a tree would continue that rate of growth to that height. We know that there are limits in nature and that the amount of change that's possible isn't unlimited. So again, back to the Galapagos finches. Before the drought occurred, we saw birds with small beaks, we saw birds with big beaks. And so at the end of the drought, it's not that we saw anything really new develop. All we saw is a shift in the percentages or in the ratio. And so again, after that drought, it turned out that once the rain came back, the beak size decreased again. And if you look at the trend, really it stayed pretty steady, kind of cyclical up and down, and that there really wasn't this long extended pattern of change over time. And certainly we didn't see any new traits develop. It's not like there was any new high-tech beak that arose given this change in the environment. It was simply what was already there, just slightly different percentages. And so again, with the peppered moths, we shifted from dark to light moths. The proportion changed. There weren't any new traits, no new coloring, no new patterning, no new species. The moths were still moths. So given the observations that we've made with natural selection, the question arises, yes, we've seen shifts in populations over time, but those shifts have been relatively small, and they've been shifts in the traits that already existed. So how then does a unicellular bacteria become a multicellular complex organism like a dog? Where does that new information, the new genetic code to make all those new body parts and organs and all of that complexity come from? That's the question. And so the next chapter we'll look at is the process of mutation. We know that mutations produce new change. We've seen examples of that through the study of human genetic disorders. We'll look at some arguments that have been made about the potential for mutations to be beneficial.